The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor, Thomas Goss, and it is my privilege, my joy, to bring you this incredibly delicious music that we're about to listen to. This is really the sweet spot in this movement, and it's actually all the more so because it is so subtle and beautifully orchestrated. We left off in the last lecture, where a very mighty tutti had just winnowed its way down to an extremely soft reaction and resolution, if there can be resolutions as we understand them in common practice in this music. Now we're going to be looking at this next section here, and what we see is a return of that beautiful theme that we heard at the end of the first movement. You know, bum, 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 bum. And then the trumpets come in. Da-dum. Notice the marking here, a little outside, right? So a little distantly is really what this particular marking means in French post-romantic impressionistic scoring. Now, this is very simply accompanied by measured tremolo in the cellos and then adding the violas. Now, the violas are just coming in an octave higher, so it adds that extra bit of color and presence. And it doesn't really pick up in terms of a push until right here. And then notice pianissimo subito, so it has a little bit of push to it and then just drops off right here. And there's this wonderful cushiony chord right in here. You can see the A-flat octaves here in third bassoon, contrabassoon, right? And then we've got our fifth right here, and then the mediant of the C, right? Okay, but against that, we're also seeing this E-flat chord here, right? So octave E-flats, written B-flats in horn sounding down a fifth. And then we've got this D-flat here sounding G-flat, and this F here sounding B-flat. So like an E-flat minor chord stuck on top of an A-flat chord, right? That gives us this beautiful A-flat ninth chord. As that chord provides this beautiful background, the horns plus the bassoons are just absolutely perfectly together, especially when you have them playing pianissimo. First violins, soli and divisi in two, right? So these are 8 violins only. Now, of course, in a smaller orchestra, that might be a whole section of violins. But limiting the violins gives it a very distant, almost starchy quality to it, because there are really only 4 violins playing on each note, right? So it's a slightly wispy, ephemeral sound. Now here, the strings are accompanying pretty much the same thing in the horns. The voicing of this chord is done a little differently, with switching the first and second part with the third and fourth part. That doesn't really matter at all. It's just that Debussy changes it around because he's changing what's going to happen with the chords in just a second, right? So it makes more sense to switch those parts. All right, but the whole point I was trying to make was that we've got this lovely motion right in here, right? So it's measured tremolo. You have to really think of the note on the downbeat as the main focus right here. We're starting off with the E flat, going up to G flat, and then turning around back to G flat, but reaching downwards from there to F, and then F, and then so on, and then ending up on a D natural. So there really is this feeling not just of motion within the bars of this sort of fluttering sound, but also a bit of contrapuntal motion against this lovely chorale in the horns. We've got more beautiful harmony right in here. Once again, just combining the bassoons with the horns and this. Now, we don't need our contrabassoon on this rock bottom note. Once again, whoever engraved this score way back in the day is notating the contrabassoons at sounding pitch, not written pitch. Now, this is kind of strange because if you look in Debussy's score, his fair copy, his final manuscript, he actually notates the contrabassoons in a standard way. What you would read would be this note here, right, in the double basses. Well, he doesn't really need the contrabassoon right in here because he's got the cellos coming in, and they are going to be able to carry that lower note. And it actually lightens the sound here. Right here we have just a very solid sound with that low A flat being played in the contrabassoon. Now here he wants things to be a little bit lighter, right, because he's setting something up, some more magic for us in the next page. And we have something similar happening here, this little floating back and forth of chords, and then here they sort of cycle around. What I think is really lovely is the way that the trumpet lifts off upwards to this written F, sounding B flat, right? We're transposing down a fourth. The written pitches are down a fourth from the sounding pitches up a fourth, right? So this is a B flat. So this lifting off into that note both times, and the way it lifts off into the motion of these circling chords. That's so lovely. Here we get into some really beautiful scoring, taking into account the motion of the different instruments and the way that they interact with each other. And once again, Debussy could score contrapuntally in really beautiful ways, as we've seen throughout this score, and definitely something showing other composers who were interested in counterpoint, but also the newer sound, that kind of post-romantic sound that combined impressionism and symbolism and a lot of other things. So right in here, clarinets and bassoons are starting off here with this combined chorale, reaching upwards, and then the same thing basically is taken over by English horn and oboes. But notice that the strings are not playing in unison. They are sort of playing this supporting figure right in here, these triplets. And I feel that that has so much more impact. The kind of scurrying feeling of the strings behind this lovely upward reaching motion. Now here, this is like textbook scoring of a tutti in which everybody is doubling everybody else. So we've got winds and strings working together beautifully with a little bit of horn. So what is everybody doing here? Well, we've got our first violins in octaves, and then we've got our second violins playing inside, interlocking with the first violins, and then below that we have the Debussy violas, and they are sort of following along, right? We've got the lower part tracking the second violins at the octave below, and then we've got the upper part doubling at the octave below the first violins, right? So it's this kind of interlocking series of octaves that create their own harmony. And then moving onwards here, we see the same thing. We've got the cellos coming in an octave below the lower note of the seconds, and the violas continuing on their role, playing octaves below the firsts, right? And this is unison. It says Debussy, but it doesn't mark unison afterwards, but that's just taken for granted. Okay, so looking at the winds, what is going on here with them? Well, actually, they are doubling every single pitch that is happening here, right? You see the flutes playing that little top line right in here, and then the oboes taking over for that top line right in there of the first. And then right in here, first oboe is tracking the top line of the seconds. I'm not going to go through every single pitch right in here, but you'll notice that there are certain octaves here that kind of cross, like the violins going down to the violas, right? So, for instance, here you've got the first clarinet playing the bottom note of the second violins, and then you've got the second clarinet covering the same line as the lower violas, right? So every pitch is doubled in different ways, and every once in a while you'll get a pitch that is actually sort of tripled, if you know what I mean. In other words, we've got the English horn and the first clarinet playing the same notes, right? Just don't forget your transposition, right? So down a perfect fifth, down a major second. And then we've got oboes and bassoons, then the English horn right in the middle here, and that is playing together with the strings as they go on in a similar way. And you can actually just really see what happens with this kind of interlocking octave harmony. And what's interesting here is that this is 6 voices working inside each other. And here, he doesn't bother supplying extra weight to one of these lines, right? It's enough for him to cover the cellos and the violas with the bassoons. And then he covers the upper firsts and seconds with the oboe. But interestingly, he only covers the lower firsts with the English horn, right? He doesn't cover the lower seconds with anything. And he doesn't really need to. Could have thrown in a clarinet, but the sound is strong enough right in there. Now, interestingly, I think this is the funnest part of all. He only throws in third horn right in here to double anything. It is basically playing that same top line an octave lower, if you work out your transposition, which ends up being the same thing as the lower Debussy seconds. And we've got a similar interlocking pattern going on here in the strings. So what is the effect of all of this doubling? Right? I'll talk about this last bar in a second. Well, you end up with an extremely rich sound here, and I love the way that the elements come together, right? We had that same separation. Forgive me for not mentioning this B flat right in here. Sounding B flat written F. So you have the winds leaping up here, or pushing upwards, and then you have the strings behind them supporting, and then they come together, mezzo forte, expressive, and unify their functions. And that is such a cool idea, like having things coalesce. And there are definitely ways to take much more complex functions and then have them coalesce together into a beautiful tutti, a beautiful homophonic tutti, as we've got here. So you'll have the rich colors of the winds inside the strings, but you aren't supposed to hear this as the strings being kind of secondary to the winds. You're supposed to sort of hear them unified, right? And a good orchestra will do this. The winds will play inside the strings rather than playing over them. And then here, things take on a different quality, right? Because you have the mixture of kind of a square wave instrument, the clarinets, and the flutes to a bit have a square wave kind of a sound, and then the kind of sawtooth wave sounds of the oboe family and the bassoons, and the horns to a degree. Then you kind of back off and you have that more warm sound just of the double reeds combining there, right? And then you just have that wonderful intense sound of the horn, but the horn is just supporting, right? It's playing the lower second violin line, but the overtones are supporting the first violins. And it should completely merge inside that chord and supply everything that is required there. So there really is no need for the clarinets to play along too or to fill in all the harmony, right? And he is basically weaning the ear as he goes off of the idea of doubling. And then he pushes in this little jolt of color right in here. So second and third bassoon, supplying this low A flat right in here. You've got the G flat supported by the horns. The third horn is basically doubling the upper cello line. And then the first horn supports the melodic curve, right? Playing an octave below the firsts. And actually, that is unison with the violas. And it just really gives this wonderful dense sound, right? Just when you have been a little bit weaned off of the idea of complete doubling of every single tone with the winds for the strings, you get this little jolt here and then backing off, right? Seconds, violas, and cellos continue on. And then we subtract the seconds. And it's not because the pitches are getting too low. The seconds could continue to play this, right? They could be easily play this, C, D flat, B flat, and then back to D flat, right? That's totally within their range. But it just keeps subtracting a certain amount of trebliness. The sounds are sort of getting softer and denser and more distant, right? And then we have this little punch right in here. Pizzicato, forte, and sforzando reaction above. And this little half-step trill. And then right in here, A flat to B flat is a sort of a relaxation of the tension between the half step. It's sort of like a buzzing like bees, right, when you've got the half step trill. But when you open it up to a whole step trill, there's a sense of relaxation in the harmony. And then this is doubled by this low A flat. Now, remember, old notation, which is kind of the same transposition as the F trumpet, right? It's up a perfect fourth. So it's kind of an interesting thing in a way, because in new notation, this would be just written as an E flat in the bass staff, right in the middle of the bass staff, transposing down a fifth. And so it doesn't really seem like all that low of a note, and it really isn't for a good low horn player. But the point is that what you're aiming for here is just real solid unity with that sense of A flatness, right? Coming from this trill. And a really pro horn player at the top of their game with a big cello section can just merge right inside there with their muted horn, right? We change to mutes here. So listening to Kaleidoscope, you can see the problem here. And that is not that the second player isn't a pro. I mean, they're great. But it's just that the cello section isn't big enough to mask their sound. But that's not a big issue. It's kind of interesting to hear some colors come out when you've got a smaller string section, how it changes the blend and the balance, but will still work in a different way. Okay, so let's listen to all of that stuff, and then we'll go on to the just wonderful restatement of the main melody of this movement. Check everything out that I just talked about, the way that this comes together, coalesces into this beautiful combined tutti right in here. And then how Debussy weans your ear off of the sense of mass, wind, and string combinations to a little bit more subtle with just all double reeds as the music goes diminuendo to piano. And then right in here, listen to how the music stays beautifully accompanied just by this horn right in the middle, which should be absorbed into the sound. And then how the horns kind of come back still playing soft, but it adds a certain density to the tone. And then continuing on with seconds on top, no doubling, and then just losing the seconds and all violas and cellos. Right, and then, of course, listen for that second horn coming in there and playing that low note. And by the way, it is really hard to do this kind of stuff. Not just to play in tune with a mute on for a horn player when they can't get into that bell and really adjust the intonation as well as they could. They'll be holding the mute, and the presence of their hand may make some difference or not in horn playing, but they really want to just have their hand in there and to be playing really, really soft. But the mute does help in this case to get just things down to a whisper if the horn player can control it. Listen for all of those things. Now on the previous screen, of course, we've got this lovely return of the horns playing the same thing that we heard at the end of the first movement. And this is going to sort of develop as the piece nears its conclusion. And just listen for the strings coming in under there. They're very subtle at the beginning, but then you hear them start to emerge more, right? And then the reduced strings on top, reduced first violins, and this lovely da da da, just really, really nicely done. And the combination of bassoons and horns just completely working together in this lovely cushion with a little bit of help from cello. So enjoy that, and then I will see you for the second half of this lecture. And now for some masterfully cinematic scoring. And this has been so imitated by film composers. And yet it's so powerful and yet so simple, right? It is actually very beautifully, simply direct scoring. And it's also a great passage for conductors to conduct because they can just shift that orchestra around in beautiful ways and get the tiniest nuance of subtlety in the way that the tempo moves around, the fluctuations of the dynamics. It's just a really, really great exercise for conductors. And you can kind of imagine Debussy having watched the initial premiere, which had a somewhat lackluster interpretation, and just itching for himself to get up there, though he wasn't really that well known as a conductor, but he could obviously see how it could be something incredible for a conductor to direct and get the most out of the orchestra, which it has been ever since. There are some pieces where, yes, you can play them without a conductor and do it very well, as we are hearing from Kaleidoscope. But the conductor really can help tie things together in an incredible way and also really put a personal stamp on it with the subtleties rather than with a big ego. What's really beautiful is how Kaleidoscope deals with these massive fluctuations of tempo without getting off. There were a couple of moments where things started to fall apart just very slightly in our previous audio that you might have noticed. But here they just really stay together beautifully. And let's break this down. It's actually the kind of thing where, like, once I explain everything on this first page, then all we have to do is just kind of check in with the next two screens. And then you'll sort of see how everything is working, and I can just make a few stray comments, right? But let's get down the structure of this incredible bit of textural scoring. All right. So, firstly, let's start with the harps. So the second harp is basically playing a kind of alternating tremolo over the same sounding pitches, but enharmonically, right? So we have A flat and F, and those two pitches are being repeated enharmonically, G sharp and E sharp, right? So they're going back and forth and back and forth. Now, the beautiful touch here is that those same pitches just come in an octave above just every other beat. Almost like waves or wings slowly beating. It just has that wonderful sound. And, if you've ever been out on a gently rocking boat in the middle of the night in the moonlight, or even just during the daytime when the light is just right, Debussy just captures it so beautifully, even though his own experience of being out on a boat was pretty limited. I think he took the ferry from France to England and then back when he went out to the south of England to finish scoring this piece. But he just basically watched the ocean from the hotel. This really is a beautiful bit of filigree, right? It's not really the fundamental thing that's happening, but it really supplies the sense of back and forth motion, the static fluctuation. And then, as for the harmony, rock bottom, we've got 4 contrabasses solo, he says, right? So just holding down this D flat all the way through. D flat 5th. He's having the 4th horn play the 5th here. Once again, just to get that note absolutely perfect. That is the specialty of the 4th horn and the 2nd horn. They are supposed to be able to play those low notes, and it's just really tragic because you don't get all the glory, and yet that is as tough as anything the first will ever do. And it's also one of those things like, say, when you get focal dystonia or your embouchure starts to change with age, it's one of those things that starts to become more and more difficult. Because of the whole seniority of the system, it can be career-ending when you start to lose control of what, to a lot of people who are orchestrating music out there, especially for film, they're like not even thinking about the low notes of the horn and low horn players and so on. In fact, the way that horn players sit in sections in film orchestras is completely different. Everything is scored in order of pitch, 1, 2, 3, 4, or more if they've got more horns. They don't have the second and the third interlocking their parts or anything like that. And everybody who signs on is a complete whiz at horn, and they can play low and high equally well. There might be some specialists and some real hot shots that you always want to be your first horn, but aside from that, there isn't that same sense of specialty and seniority and everything else. It's just who you hire to do what. But when I see these low notes, I see the struggle, and I also see the tragedy. I personally know some horn players who had to give up their playing careers, their serious careers, just because of that difficulty of being able to control those low notes with age. Okay, so not to harp on that for too long, but that supplies the upper note of our D flat 5th, and it just continues on and on and on. It's really tough to play and to control and to merge just seamlessly into what's going on here. Now, to make things more cushioned and nebulous and so on and so forth, we've got the cellos basically playing this measured tremolo, going back and forth between D flat and A flat. So they are sort of filling in that sound right in there, and everybody is trying to play as softly as possible. And that's what makes this texture possible throughout. Now, here's a really magical moment right in here. Sur la touche, so in other words, sul tasto tremolo. And it's not like unmeasured tremolo. It's a measured tremolo, but still, because of the speed of the music, it is going to feel like unmeasured tremolo. This little voice moving around in here adds this almost sense of singing. Plus, when you're adding the horns into there, the overtones will almost make you feel like it's singing with some orchestras. It just really depends on the approach of the orchestra and possibly the acoustics of the hall. But yeah, it's just a really wonderful moment, the way that this rises up. And then these internal harmonies, the violas add to this strange sense of tension right in here. Okay, well, we'll get into that in a minute. All right. Now let's finally talk about the upper part of the sound picture. So first of all, you've got very, very high A-flat artificial harmonics. Right, so this is going to be the highest A-flat on the piano. And it just continues on and on and on. And notice that Debussy is really softening things here. He says, first players of each desk solely. It's almost like saying Debussy, right? He could have gotten the same exact thing by saying div in 2 and adding a bar rest under this all the way through. It would be the same exact thing. First flute solo. First oboe solo. Now, who's the big star here? It's the oboist. They are going to come through this a little bit more, and that is why Debussy gives them more of the articulation, more of the events in the melody, right? So, da da da, da 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 da, right? Da 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 da. And then, meanwhile, the first flute is just basically coloring what the oboe is doing. Ba-da, da, 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 right? Da, 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 and so on. It's just one of those combinations that is so gorgeous and so simple. It's just flute plus oboe. And it has just the most beautiful sound, especially if you have players who are really listening to each other. That first flute and that first oboe, hopefully they respect each other and they make beautiful music together in the course of the orchestra, but they've been listening to each other play different things, and now they have to combine and just really do it beautifully. And notice just how subtle the dynamics are here. He never allows anything to get too big. The impact is in the meaning of the music. It is not in how loud people can play. This is how soft people can play and add nuance. We've got this wonderful idea right in here of tremolo seconds being punctuated every other beat by the first clarinet. And the first clarinet is playing this very squishy mezzo staccato all the way through, right? So, it really is a wonderful idea. And then I love this right in here. That relationship continues on with this dotted rhythm. The clarinet's coming in on the second beat of the dotted rhythm and then adjusting upwards as the line climbs. Such a cool idea. That is really all there is to it, except for like this middle voice right in here of the second horn. And that is it. That is how this works. It's so beautiful, and there's so much going on there acoustically, in terms of the overtones and the way it's put together, and it's just so gorgeous. Now looking at this second page here, all the relationships are the same, so we don't really need to discuss that too much. We're adding a little bit of first horn right in here. And the first horn is basically covering the same part as the second violins. So it's just adding a little bit of weight right there. And everybody is playing really soft. And that way, you can push the flute all the way down here to these Fs and hear it perfectly well. No interference whatsoever. So that's all going to work fine. Now, here's a cool thing, and that is first clarinet and the second violins flipping the script, right? So the first clarinet is basically playing a sustained version of that voice, taking over from the first horn. And then you hear the little pizzicato droplets of the second horn, very much reversing what happened before with the little mezzo staccato from the clarinet. Okay, so Debussy just restarts the entire thing. And notice that he gave the fourth horn player a bit of a break. And then the third horn is basically playing the same note an octave higher. So yeah, so the fourth player gets a little bit of a rest. from their just maddening task. And it's not like the low A flat won't be heard, right? We've got it in here with the cellos. It's still a presence there. So a little bit more motion as we start over, right? Da 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 da, from the sol tasto middle strings, and then kind of the same stuff as before. Da 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 ba 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 ba. And here we're adding the second clarinet right in there, so the texture is getting just a little thicker. Okay, but then it lightens up a little bit. We're losing our first harp. I haven't mentioned the changes to the harp part, but it's just gorgeous fluttering and doubling of the same pitches and harmonically going back and forth and so on. Not only is it a wonderful sound, but it also prevents stomping, repeating, playing the same string too quickly in succession, creating sort of a zzz kind of a sound. And then kind of the same exact thing happening again there, clarinet and second violin doubling, but this time they're doubling at the octave, right? So we've got the seconds rising from this A flat. By the time they get to here, clarinet comes in and starts doubling an octave below, and that is just really a wonderful effect, because what is going on here is that the two lines are crossing. So as this rises up, they sort of get to this point right here, same E flat, right? And then the seconds rise, the flute plus the oboe like go under it, but you'll still hear the flute and the oboe louder than the second violin. The second violin shouldn't supersede, right? The clarinet shouldn't stick out bigger, because that would really be a shame, and especially considering the music that follows, which is somewhat cheery and sort of fresh and is a little bit of a wake-up from this reverie. You will just have to hear that yourself when we go to the credits. I will just leave you with that now. All right, so listen for all of those things, the voice crossing right in here, and for the octaves in the clarinet right there, as opposed to before when the clarinets were mostly doubling at pitch, right? And a little bit of horn right in there, really, really soft. You know, when a horn player plays incredibly soft in a texture like this, it can almost sound like a clarinet, or the clarinet and the horn can just really imitate each other. So that's going on here as well. And, you know, listen for like the little droplets here of pizzicato playing off of the clarinet, which is an echo of back here when the little droplets of clarinet were playing off of the second violins. Okay, and then just like the way that this sort of scallops into the end of the dotted rhythm with the clarinet. It's just a wonderful little feature, and you can hear it. And then, of course, the sol tasto effect right in here of these tremolo strings. It's such a wonderful passage. And then, of course, the way everything is put together, the very slow beating heart right in here, or beating wings of the harps. This very, very high sound right in here. I've heard in some recordings the conductors like really limiting this, like trying to get the firsts to play almost invisibly on this high A flat, but the Kaleidoscope, you can hear them, and I think it's just wonderfully eerie when it is a strong part of the harmony. Then, of course, the solo double basses, the tremolo cellos going back and forth between that low pitch and this sounding A flat written E flat in old notation. And yeah, as I mentioned before, just kind of the warm heart right in here, the sol tasto kind of rising up inside as you hear the beautiful melody come over the top. And just listen to the combination of these two players, right? They're two of the best players in the orchestra, your first flute player and your first oboist. You know, they should be world class. And here in New Zealand with the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra, we have got Robert Orr on oboe. That guy could play in any orchestra in the world. And Bridget Douglas, you may have heard her playing in my Orchestration 103 and 102 courses. And you can hear that she's just out of this world, right? Just to die for. Players on that level combining together is just so magical, so incredible. So enjoy the end of this lecture's music, and we will meet again in a few days here on Patreon, and probably right away out there once this is publicly released. And thank you so much, everybody, for watching these lectures, for your support, for your indulgence as I try to work around all of these different things, trying to juggle educational projects and editing and running the community and everything else. I really appreciate it. And, it's really become a big part of my life in a way I wasn't expecting, and it's extremely rewarding. And I thank you all for everything you're doing to make it possible for me.